So, we have a new camera angle, a new microphone. I think it's about time for another Grading the Films episode. This time, we're looking at everybody's favorite director, especially for the visuals, Wes Anderson, specifically his film The Grand Budapest Hotel. Now, I give this disclaimer at the start of all of my Grading the Films episodes because it's worth repeating every single time, and that is that color grading isn't most of the look of a film. Color grading only gets you that last 10%. You have to depend on things like lighting, set design, costuming. There's a lot of other factors that go into how a film looks besides the color grading. So, if you have footage that wasn't shot in an intentional way with a certain focal length, certain depth of field, if you didn't have a particular set design, if you weren't very careful about the colors and the costumes, very intentional about the lighting, all of that stuff, your film isn't going to look good. No matter how much you do in color grading, you're never going to be able to get it to look like what you want it to look like. Now again, this bears repeating with all of my episodes, but this one in particular, because with Wes Anderson, the Wes Anderson look isn't a color grading look. It is very much a set design and lighting look. Set design and lighting is so much more important to the look of a Wes Anderson film than color grading is. The cinematography, the framing, all of that is far more important. And it's very important that you are very intentional and you think about that when you're shooting your footage. And then color grading should again just be that last 10%. But assuming you have footage that you're happy with, then this video will show you how to get to that extra 10%. And it's actually very easy. The color grading is very simple, so this shouldn't take long, but hopefully it will be helpful to you. Now, one site that I'm a really big fan of, which you're looking at here, is Shot on What. Now, this is a website which compiles information about different films, what type of camera they were shot on, how they were graded, what lenses were used, all that sort of stuff. So it's really helpful when you're deciding how to emulate the look of a film, essentially. So if we scroll down here, you can see we have a number of pieces of information. For example, we can see that this film was shot on celluloid film with an ARRICAM studio camera. We can see that the stock was 35mm negative film, and we can also see that the film actually uses 3 different aspect ratios. This is 4:3, this is 1.85, which is about 16:9, a little wider, and then we have 2.39, which is standard super wide cinematic aspect ratio. And each of these aspect ratios are used in different parts of the film, and we'll get into that when we start looking at the footage. Another thing we can see here, this was again shot on film, 35mm film, but one thing you'll notice if you look at the footage is that this film doesn't look like it was shot on film. I thought it was shot on digitally originally. You could easily convince me or anyone else it was shot digitally because there isn't a lot of film grain, and film grain is one of the most distinct markers that a given film was shot on film. So there's not really much grain. There are kind of some celluloid colors, but those are very, very easily replicated in a digital editing system. So normally with a film that was shot on film, I would use something like Film Convert to emulate the qualities of the film, but in this case we're just going to treat it as if it was shot digitally because for our purposes it was. Now, another neat little thing which you'll see right here is the finishing system was actually DaVinci. Some of you might know this as DaVinci Resolve. It's a now free plugin. It wasn't when this film came out, or not plugin, but it's a standalone color grading program, and there is a free version of it. And that free version is actually what we're going to use to do this color grading. So anyone can download it. It's completely free. There are some limitations compared to the full version, but unless you're doing actual professional color grading, you don't need the full version. The basic version, free version, is very featured, and so we're going to use that. And for that reason, I think this is actually the first time that this color grading the films episode will use the same color grading application that the original film used. So that's kind of unique and interesting if you care about that sort of stuff. But that said, let's go ahead and dive into the footage. So we're going to be using 4 different clips from the original film. This one is at the very beginning. This is a 1.85 aspect ratio. Then we have this shot, which is 2.39. It's a little later in the film. Much wider, as you can see, shot anamorphic. You can't see it very well in this footage, but there is some anamorphic distortion on the very ends, and we'll talk about that. Then we have this clip, which is a 4:3. You can see very clearly there. Again, nothing too fancy other than we're just acknowledging the aspect ratio. And then lastly, we have another 4:3 shot, very similar to this one, the same train and everything. But as you can see, this one is black and white. Now, the footage we're going to be using to emulate those looks, first of all, we have this clip right here. I'm sure you've seen this clip if you've watched my videos. I use it quite frequently. As you can see right here, if I just toggle this real quick, I've already corrected my footage, and I've done an episode on how to color correct footage, so I don't cover it in each of my Grading the Films episodes. So I'll link that in the cards. You can check that out if you don't know how to color correct footage. But your first step of color grading should always be color correction. And then we have this clip of a train station, which I'm going to be using to emulate the look in the hotel. We got kind of the same lighting. The lighting isn't quite as soft here. You'll notice soft light is a very consistent quality. All of the shots have very soft lighting in the film. This one does too, but this one, there is a bit of harsh lighting coming in through these windows up here, but overall it's fairly soft, and we should still be able to make it work. And then the last clip is right here, this shot right here of her walking. We're going to use this clip for both of those 4:3 shots, so we're going to do a color version and a black and white version. But anyway, let's dive right in. For starters, you can see we're looking at this clip right here, and the first thing that should immediately stand out is how red the clip is. It has a very rosy tint to it, a very strong tint. You can see that in our parade right here, especially in the highlights and the midtones. There's a lot more red. You can see it very clearly in our histogram over here, our waveform. Even in our vector scope, we can see everything is leaning towards red. Now, again, if you look at this footage, this is not just the color grading. If you look at her skin, she has very rosy cheeks, and possibly makeup was used to do that. She's got kind of this beige coat, and we see a lot of beige and reddish tones, which lend themselves very well to this very strong reddish rosy tint. So again, just to point out how much set design impacts the style and look of this. So now if we go over here to our clip, we can see we have kind of this beige grass back here, this tan grass, which will work great. But we also have, as you can see, a lot of blues in the clip, which will mean that we won't be able to perfectly replicate the look. So if I finish this and you're like, what, that footage doesn't look at all like the original shot, that's because we're not dealing with identical set design, identical lighting conditions. This is just the shot that I had. So we're gonna go ahead and create another corrector node right here. I'm going to use this for our grade. So the very first thing we can do, is just take our gain and just, push it towards red. Immediately you can start to see the results. We can kind of push it more towards purple and pink. And already we have something here. We could bring that back a bit. And we can also do the same thing here in the midtones. Maybe even a little more pink. But that might be a little bit too strong, so we just kind of push it really far and then bring it back. So now immediately we can go back and say, okay, these are starting to look more similar. Come on, move over there. They've got a very rosy, very orangey look to them now. So you can see the before and after. But there's more we can do here. So if we look here, we can see we have a lot of kind of stray highlights, and that's kind of our sky back here, the white parts of the scarf right there. And we don't really have that here, so we could, for example, go into our log and kind of bring down our highlights just to kind of compress those super brights. And then we could go back into our primaries and bring up the offset if we wanted to brighten it up. Bring up the offset a little bit. I'll bring up our gain. And now you, of course, notice that it's very contrasty. And so we can bring our lift down, back down to balance out our highlights. So now we have a much brighter image, and our highlights aren't quite as control compared to the rest of the image. And we could also, if we want to tweak our midtones, I think we could bring our gamma down a little bit, just hopping back and forth and comparing them. So that's pretty good. I think our gain could even afford to be a little more rosy. Another thing too you'll notice is that there's actually more blue if you look in this really dark statue. That statue is kind of tinted blue, which suggests to me that our shadows are tinted a little more blue. So we could take our lift and just, push that towards blue. Very, very subtle amount. Just like that. And we could even bring down that even lesser extent. Very, very subtle kind of tint in the blue, and just bring our lift down a bit more. And I also think we can bring down our saturation. Actually, I think what we might do instead, because I talked about these blue jeans in particular were going to be a problem, what we can actually do is go into our hue versus saturation, which is a really cool tool. This is a curve that lets you control how saturated a given color is. So if we come here, we just create this real quick. Even widen that. Oh, there we go. Okay. So you can see the specific hue is actually a little closer to cyan than I thought. So now you can see his blue jeans are actually not blue at all. You might think those were like gray pants. But because we brought up that saturation when we expanded the contrast out, now we've brought out that super bright blue that was super distracting, and now it's gone, which is good. So again, you can see that before super bright blue, now we've brought it down so it's not so distracting. Now you'll see this isn't perfect. Again, most of the issues here aren't with the color grading. It's that 90% that's the set design, how it's shot, the lighting, all of that. And again, we have these very bright skies, these very bright reflective parts in our scarf right here. And we could, go into our curve right here and just kind of use a shoulder to just kind of shoulder that off a little bit. And that helps a little bit, but there's only so much you can do. Really, if I had shot this properly, and I was specifically trying to replicate this, I would use a lot more diffusion to block out and diffuse that light a lot more so that it looks more like the original shot. But if you took a shot that was looked like this and did this type of grading, you could do the same grading steps I did and get here. All right, so now we have this, and again, we're comparing this to this shot. Now this shot is also very orange. This has even less of a rosy tint to it. It's just bright orange. And you'll notice we have these like possibly limestone walls and this very bright orange carpet, and we've got this orange tablecloth. Again, this isn't orange just because you took a slider or someone took a slider and pushed it orange. It's orange because the scene is orange. It has lots of orange stuff in it, and that is a big part of why it looks the way it does. Now with this shot, our floors are kind of orange. We do have that limestone, so we do have some stuff going for us. We don't have the bright orange carpet, but we have a lot of stuff going for us with this shot. So now let's go ahead and add another node. And I mean, to start out with, we could just very simply take the offset and it's orange. I mean, we're there, right? Well, I mean, of course we're not. I wouldn't be making this video if it was that simple. You'll notice that the highlights have a much orangier tint than the shadows do. The shadows, it's a lot more subtle. It's still there, but more subtle. So rather than, just taking our offset I'm going to do each of these parts individually, and I'm going to take my lift and bring it up just a little bit, my gamma, a bit more, and then our gain, I'm going to bring it up a bunch. Now, one problem you'll notice if you look at the scopes is that as we're doing this, we're starting to crush our blues and clip our reds. And I'm actually going to tweak this a bit more real quick. But the point is, we're clipping stuff, so to resolve that, we can adjust our lift and bring that up a bit if we wanted to, and take our gain and bring it down so we're no longer clipping. And if we see here, I actually think there's probably too much red there, so I'll dial it back and then just boost our gain again to compensate. And our lift, I think we can actually afford to bring down a bit. We can afford to crush our shadows a little bit, and then maybe bring our gamma up, maybe push a little more orange into it. So now if we compare them, we're pretty close. Actually, we could afford to put more orange in there. It is a very orange scene. So now we've got that. Again, not perfect, but the footage isn't the same, so we're going to have a hard time perfectly replicating it, without that bright orange carpet, and with some of this harsh lighting affects it as well. So now let's go into the last one, and this one, we got two grades we're going to do on this one. We got this color one, and then we have our black and white one. So let's start with the color one since we've been doing color. If you look at the scopes, you'll see exactly the same thing we've seen on the rest of the film. It's warm, and more so in the highlights than the shadows. So if we add our corrector node, we can just push everything. Yeah, less than that for sure. Maybe a little rosier in the highlights. But now we have this, and I think we could bring up our gamma a little bit. Bring down our gain just to kind of balance out the contrast. And, we can compare that now. Went from that very balanced shot to now this bright, kind of rosy, reddish orange. And if we go back and compare it, this shot is actually a bit darker. Again, this is an outdoor shot, so obviously it's going to be brighter. But if we wanted to replicate how kind of dark that is, we just bring down our lift, just bring everything down a bit. And now we've got a little bit of a darker image there that's a little more comparable. But I wouldn't do this because this shot is outside, so I would grade it brighter because that makes more sense. What you would do in this situation, if you wanted to match these shots, is rather than looking at the image as a whole, I would just crop out this middle part since you can see outside and just grade it against this outdoor portion. But anyway, let's get into the black and white part, which in my opinion is kind of the fun part, because black and white, you don't have colors, but making something look good as black and white isn't just a question of balance the color and then get rid of the saturation. It's not that simple. There's a little bit more you have to do because contrast is a lot more important because you don't have color contrast. So let's reset this node and see, we could just get rid of the saturation. There, it's gone. But this looks very digital and kind of gross. We don't have the contrast you really want from a black and white film. Now we can bring up our gamma, bring down our lift, bring that down, maybe bring up our gamma even more. And now we have a more contrasted image. And again, we can compare real quick and you can see that looks a lot better. It's still kind of digital grossness, but it's better. And we compare this to this shot, we can see the distribution in the scopes here. We can try and match that. We can go down here to our contrast and bring up our contrast. That looks quite a bit better actually. Even bring up our gamma. And I was looking at her coat because her coat is so dark, but I think her coat is actually in the shadows is why it's going so dark. There we go. And actually probably afford to bring down the gamma. I was boosting it unnecessarily. So now we've got something better. We can boost up the contrast so much because we don't have color to worry about, and get something a little closer. But another thing I'm actually seeing here now is it looks like this actually has a color tint to it. Even though it's black and white, I think there is a bit of a color tint, which isn't too uncommon with celluloid. Even when it was black and white, there was still a little bit of color there, whether it was tinted green or red or whatever it may have been. So I could do the same thing I've been doing and just, you know, not that much, but just a very, very subtle, kind of warm it up a little bit. So much you might not even notice. And I think that looks a lot closer. Actually, maybe even less than that. We'll bring it down. There we go. So now you can see that's a way that we can kind of give some character. This, very flat, obviously very balanced because we've removed the saturation digitally, but if we add in just a little bit of a color tint, that actually brings out more character and makes it a little bit more realistic, even though this isn't actually black and white anymore. Now the last thing we're going to do is I'm actually going to go back into my edit window here, and you can see our aspect ratios obviously don't match because all this was shot in 16:9, but I do actually have some templates here. Not templates actually, but just some letter boxes and window boxes, etc. To match the aspect ratio. I made these in Photoshop. It's really easy to make. Just crunch a little bit of math, or even you can just download these online. But now you've got a 4:3. If we bring this one over here to our first clip, this box is actually 16:9 instead of 1.85. Close, but not quite the same, but it's got that same window box going on. And then lastly, our cinema aspect ratio 2.39 super wide. And you know, you could go in here and adjust the location of these clips a little bit so that the framing works within our new aspect ratio, which is sometimes something that you need to do to make sure it fits properly. But anyway, that's what we've got now. Obviously, there's still stuff you could do. Again, these shots weren't shot perfectly identically, so they're not going to look identical, but this should give you some ideas of ways you can tweak your footage to kind of get closer to this look. And you know, there's some other stuff, like for example, this very wide shot. If you look at the version in Grand Budapest Hotel here, there's some distortion, there's some vignetting, there's some corner blur, which is indicative of anamorphic. And I actually have covered how to simulate this with footage in my previous Grading the Films episode, which I'll put a card for in the title. I'm not going to bother with doing that with this, but it is possible. This was actually shot with a 25mm lens, which means it wouldn't work very well. However, you could shoot with a wider lens and simulate anamorphic look, or you could get anamorphic lens with micro four thirds cameras, which is what I shot this on. You can find projector anamorphic lenses that you can adapt to fit on the lens fairly commonly. So there's definitely inexpensive ways to shoot anamorphic if you just wanted to shoot this in anamorphic. If you really wanted to get that distortion and the edge, vignetting, and blur that you get with anamorphic. But anyway, that is it for this video. If you like this video, if you like seeing some of the things you can do to potentially get your footage, that last 10% to looking like one of Wes Anderson's films, particularly Grand Budapest Hotel, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions or comments about anything else, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, including more of these Grading the Films episodes, please hit that subscribe button.